Hey, thanks for swinging on by. This is how I make sourdough bread at home, and this is my thought process. Now, this is not a perfect recipe, but it illustrates what you need to know when you're making bread at home. Recipe and ingredients are in the description. To start, we're going to measure some flour. 500 grams in total, but 20% of that to be some form of flavored flour. In this case, rye flour. You can also use whole wheat flour. This should be at about 20 to 40%, and I wouldn't go more than that because the remainder of the flour has to come from high protein flour, and it's high protein flour that gives a structure to the bread. You can also use all-purpose flour and spike it with a bit of extra vital wheat gluten. Just a little bit fun fact for you to take home. Mix it all up really well and just set it aside. That's perhaps the most important step right now, just to get the flours measured. Next, you need to take care of your yeast. In this case, I'm using 20 grams of a semi-active yeast and feeding it from the flour mixture that I have about 3 times its weight. That's 60 grams of flour, and also adding 60 grams of water from the total wet weight. In my case, that would be 70% of the total dry goods. Alright, so get me so far? So 70%, that's about 350 grams of water. 60 grams of that goes into this cup here. You mix it well and you set that aside. Then pour the remainder of the water into the flour here, and this is what we call autolyse, or essentially just roughly mixing it up right here, as you can see, to just start forming the gluten chains, and that's essentially just what you want. Again, you can do this on a stand mixer, but I'm just showing to you here by hand for easier illustration. It doesn't have to be perfect, you just need to mix it more or less together. Wrap it up, both this as well as your yeast, and then just set it aside until your yeast has grown in size. Now, once your yeast has doubled or tripled in size, in this case 4 to 5 hours for me, it's then time to add the yeast into the autolysing dough. Now, one thing I forgot to mention was salt was already added to this dough. It's about a pinch. If you want to measure, that's about 1 to 2 grams. That's good enough. Now, you want to just add the yeast into the dough and start incorporating it together to form a cohesive dough. Now, once you have a rough mess, you can throw that out into the bench here, or you can just continue on with the dough hook into your stand mixer. That's also fine. But as you can see, what I'm doing here is I'm just mixing the dough in together to form a cohesive dough. And as you go, you can start spreading it just like what I'm doing here with the heel of my hand and really working the dough. This will take anywhere between 10 to 15 minutes, so get comfortable. You can also use what we call the slap and fold method, and this is a really useful way to develop strength as well as texture within this relatively high hydration dough. And as you can see, I'm obviously making this look a bit faster and easier, but as you slap and fold, the structure of it becomes really taut and really nice. So here, once you have the happy dough, and you can see it's really nice and stretchy after about 15 minutes of doing this, you can then transfer this into some form of vessel. In this case, I'm just using a simple ceramic pan here. Don't forget to scrape up every single itsy bit of dough you have on the table. You want to maximize your yield. Wrap that up with cling film and let that rest. Now, moving forward, we're going to continue to build strength to the dough itself, and we're going to do this through a series of stretch and fold. So after 1 hour of resting, I'm going to take the bread out, I'm going to lift up the cling film, and I'm going to wet my hands with a bit of water. And what I'm going to do is, as you can see here in the video, to go from the sides, there we go, from the sides, and lifting it up and basically letting it sit upon itself. Now, it is easier if you have someone to hold down the vessel for you, but in this case, it's just need to lift it up slowly and it will get there eventually. Now, the water really helps because it really doesn't get your hands sticky, and so as you can see over here, laying it down upon itself, pulling it up and down one more time. You can just tidy up the corners as you go about with this little process here, but essentially when you fold it upon itself, it builds strength. Wrap it up and let it rest for half an hour, and we're going to repeat this process for another 3 more times. So that's about 4 total stretch and fold. So as you can see here with the second time, this becomes much easier already as it becomes a bit stronger. So again, from the sides going upwards and then letting it down again, upwards and letting it fall, and one more time. Look at that, just like a nice little baby's butt. So we're going to let that rest for another 30 minutes and continue on with the third series of folds. As you can see from this third fold here that it gets a bit more stronger and the texture is actually much easier to work with. So do bear in mind that as you get practice with this, it does get easier to work with. Right, here we are with the fourth and last series of stretch and fold. And you can see from the side view here, it really is easy to just pull it up and just fold it upon itself. So we're going to cover this and set this aside to rest for about another half an hour, and in the meantime I'm just mixing equal parts of rice flour and normal all protein flour for my dusting flour. The rice flour here just helps because it doesn't absorb water just as fast as wheat flour, so it just makes it a bit more easy to work with. I'm also using a garnish. In this case I'm using rolled oats, but this is just me being extra and fancy. You really don't have to do this whatsoever. Now I'm using a banneton, or what we call a bread basket. You can also just use a bowl with some muslin cloth. I'm dusting the vessel or the mold with the rice and protein flour mixture. I'm also going to be doing that to my work surface as well, as you can see here. Right, so you can see I'm using both cups on my hand and just pushing it downwards towards each other, and here I'm just re-pinching it upon itself to kind of get a very nice tight seam. Now once you have a tight seam here, you can actually just stop. I made a little mistake here and I continued to fold it. As you can see, I started to fold it upon itself once again, and this caused my crumb to just be a bit more tighter. But hey, that's not really a big deal. This is also still perfectly fine as well. So I'm going to spray the surface of the dough with some water, and I'm going to roll it into the oat garnish that I have there. Again, this is purely optional. You really don't need to do this. I'm just doing this because I'm fancy, just like that. And once I have all the oats I want, I put them into the banneton, and that is basically it. Now I'm going to wrap this up with cling film and put this into the fridge for what we call a cold fermentation or cold retardation. Now this builds a lot of nice nuanced flavors, especially the sourness, but it can range from 8 to 12 hours, and depending on your sourdough yeast, even upwards to 48 hours, so do play around with your yeast a little bit. So it's been about 12 hours, and here I'm going to put in my baking steel into my oven. You don't need to use a baking steel, you can use a cast iron pan, a Dutch oven. Those work perfectly fine as well, but some form of heavy item to conduct a lot of heat to the bottom of the dough. That really helps a lot. And I'm just going to add a bowl of water to the bottom of the oven, and that just generates a bit of extra steam, which will cause the oven spring or the rise of the initial phase of the bread to be a bit better. Now again, using the same dusting flour, I'm dusting the surface of the dough, and also using a piece of parchment paper for a bit of extra insurance. You don't have to do this if you're really secure with your cooking vessel of choice. Now as you can see here, I'm going to lift up the banneton, and this is how it turned out. Pretty good. Now into the oven it goes at full temperature, and right before I close it, I also squirt it with a bit of spray. That also helps generate a bit of steam for the initial rise. Now I did make a small mistake, and that is I forgot to score the bread. So before you bake the bread, you should actually take a knife, sharp knife or a razor blade, and just score it to let the bread release some of that tension and the pressure built up when baking, and that is much better looking. Now I baked this bread at full temperature for about 10 minutes, and then I turned it down to about 180 degrees Celsius for a further 25 minutes. And as you can see, it turned out pretty well. The oven spring was not perfect, but it was still pretty good. So there you go, you can see the crumb is pretty tight, but I think that's because of the folds, but honestly speaking, this is still pretty darn good. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope this inspires you to make sourdough bread at home. If you want the recipe, it's in the description. Until then, I'll see you next time.